Okay, I think we can start now with some introductory remark. And before we get to Professor Kelly Shannon's lecture today, I want to welcome everyone, each of you, to our Baskerville Institute lecture series. Our institute is a nonprofit institute located in Salt Lake City, Utah. Our principal mission is to promote and strengthen the bonds of friendship between American and Iranian people. Our objective is to build and sustain more than 100 years of friendship between Americans and Iranians that date back to Howard Baskerville when he went to Iran in 1908. And prior to Baskerville, many American missionaries who went to Iran and helped with clinics, education, and so forth. So our institute is nonprofit, is supported by grants and donations from donors. So we are very pleased that you could join us for this lecture today on Morgan Schuster. Our publication director, Matthew Shannon, no relation to Kelly. They are both professors of history and a specialist in American-Iranian relations. So I'll pass it to Matt, who will do the introduction for Kelly, and we will start the webinar with that. Thank you again for joining us. Go ahead, Matt.
Thank you so much to everybody, and Bahman for organizing, and the Baskerville board for supporting, and Kelly for preparing what I'm sure will be a wonderful lecture for us today. Dr. Kelly Shannon is an associate professor of history and the Chastain Johnston Middle Eastern Studies Distinguished Professor of Peace Studies at Florida Atlantic University. She received her PhD from Temple University prior to that, go Owls. At Florida Atlantic, she is the director of the Peace, Justice, and Human Rights Initiative. This is very natural work for Dr. Shannon because her first book deals with the subject. It was published by University of Pennsylvania Press in 2018, and it's titled U.S. Foreign Policy and Muslim Women's Human Rights. Very good reviews in the journals that are out there, and the book is highly encouraged reading. In addition to many other publications, accomplishments, and awards from organizations like the National Endowment for the Humanities, Dr. Shannon is heavily involved in SHAFER, the Society for Historians of American Foreign Relations, both doing work in the SHAFER governance structure and also as the recipient in 2019 of the Stuart Bernath Lecture Prize, which SHAFER awards. So rather than continue to turn this into a lecture in and of itself, I'll turn the mic over to Dr. Kelly Shannon. Thank you.
Thank you, Matt, for that generous introduction. Thank you all for coming today. And thank you to Bahman and the Baskerville Institute for inviting me to speak to all of you. My lecture today focuses on W. Morgan Schuster, a 34-year-old American financial expert who served as Iran's Treasurer General in 1911 during the final phase of the Constitutional Revolution. This was just 2 years after the young American missionary Howard Baskerville gave his life in Iran fighting alongside the Constitutionalists. Like Baskerville, Schuster became an important symbol of American-Iranian friendship. My research on Schuster is part of my broader current book project on US-Iran relations from the Constitutional Revolution through the 1953 coup, in which the United States and Great Britain overthrew Iran's democratically elected Prime Minister, Mohammad Mossadegh. In this book, I hope to illustrate and illuminate the foundations of the US-Iran relationship and demonstrate that the current hostility between the two nations was not inevitable. In fact, the United States and Iranians had a generally friendly relationship prior to 1953. I examined various types of American-Iranian interactions for this project, from state-to-state diplomatic relations to the interaction of American and Iranian non-state actors. As I began my research, Schuster immediately stood out to me as someone who had an outsized impact on how Americans and Iranians saw one another in the early 20th century. Plus, his story is just fascinating. So if you're interested in learning more about my work on Morgan Schuster, I wrote a chapter about him in the forthcoming volume that will be published later this spring by Bloomsbury Press, American-Iranian Dialogues, which, of course, Matt Shannon is the editor for. In the interest of time, I'll provide you with just the highlights of what Schuster did in Iran, and we'll focus the remainder of my talk on Schuster's view on Iran and Iranians and how he influenced American public opinion at the time. The Constitutional Revolution was the first mass democratic movement in the Islamic world. During the revolution, which lasted from about 1905 through the end of 1911, Iranian nationalists successfully advocated for a constitutional monarchy, fought to defend their recently adopted constitution from the new Shah, Muhammad Ali Shah Qajar, who is pictured here. He sought to quash the country's fledgling parliament when he took the throne in 1907. And they battled to maintain their nation's sovereignty in the face of Russian and British imperial manipulation. At its heart, the Constitutional Revolution is a story about the collision of Iranians' aspirations for sovereignty, justice, and democracy with British and Russian imperialism. The democratic impulse of the Iranian constitutionalists, as well as Schuster's powerful position as Treasurer General, his sensational ouster by Imperial Russia in December 1911, and his subsequent public relations campaign to promote sympathy for Iran, influenced the attentive American public's perception of and support for the constitutionalists. It was during the Constitutional Revolution that large numbers of Americans and Iranians formed enduring perceptions of one another that contextualized future American-Iranian interactions. While Iran had not historically featured very much in the American imagination, Morgan Schuster stirred American public support for the Iranians' cause at the time. The Constitutionalists' attempts to reform their country and defend its sovereignty appealed to progressive era Americans. They believed in notions of justice, democracy, and fair play. Consequently, Iranians became more sympathetic and legible to the American attentive public, that is, those Americans who paid attention to the news and global affairs. By the start of 1911, the year that Schuster went to Iran, the revolutionary situation appeared to be stabilizing. The Constitutionalists had won the day in July 1909, just months after Howard Baskerville's death, when they seized the capital city of Tehran, deposed Muhammad Ali Shah, replaced him with his young son, and reinstated the Majlis, Iran's democratically elected parliament. For the next 2 years, the Majlis governed without royal interference. During this period, the Iranian government struggled to extricate itself from debt to European banks, end British and Russian meddling in Iran's affairs, and build a modern nation state. Resisting the imperial powers was the biggest challenge. In 1907, Great Britain and Russia had signed the Anglo-Russian Agreement, which, among other things, divided Iran into zones of influence. Iran remained an independent country, but Russia claimed the northern provinces as its sphere of influence. The British claimed the south, and the middle was a neutral buffer zone between the two areas. And you can see here on the map on the left, it lays out what the spheres of influence were. Both powers interfered in Iran's internal affairs, as they had done since the 19th century, and they expected the Iranian government to consult them on all policies that affected their respective zones. The two imperial powers, of course, had not consulted Iran about this arrangement, and the constitutionalists in the Majlis saw the Anglo-Russian agreement as illegitimate. The Majlis deputies recognized that they needed help to reform their country if their revolution was to be a success. Iran already employed foreign advisors, but most European advisors had proven unreliable. Many used their positions for personal gain, and many were lackeys of the Russians and British who did not act in Iran's best interest. The Majlis concluded that they needed an independent force, and Americans fit the bill nicely. The United States had won its independence from Great Britain, and the US government had shown no interest in colonizing or influencing Iran. Howard Baskerville's countrymen thus held great appeal. Iran requested that the US government recommend American advisors to assist with the reorganization of the Iranian government's finances. The United States readily agreed, and President William Howard Taft personally recommended Schuster. US policy toward Iran had been friendly but distant since the two governments had opened diplomatic relations in the 1850s, and the United States remained aloof from Iran's political affairs, even when Iran sought greater US involvement. Sending American advisors, however, fit with the Taft administration's policy of dollar diplomacy. Under this policy, the US government facilitated private American loans to foreign governments. In return, those governments had to employ American financial experts as advisors to reorganize their financial systems in line with those Americans' directives. Of course, such reorganization typically benefited American banks and corporations. Thus, from May through December 1911, Schuster and his small team of fellow Americans worked to reorganize the Iranian government's finances. Schuster and the four other American advisors, Frank Cairns, Charles McCaskey, Ralph Hills, and Bruce Dickey, had previously worked for the United States government. In keeping with US dollar diplomacy, these men severed all official ties to the US government in order to contract their services to Iran as private citizens. Once in Iran, in an arrangement unusual for American advisors to foreign governments, the men held government positions, with Schuster occupying the powerful position of Treasurer General. From the Iranian perspective, the men of the Schuster mission were Iranian state actors, although they remained foreigners and conceivably at least informal representatives of the United States. The Schuster mission was in keeping with dollar diplomacy in many respects, but the situation was also unique. Most American advisors went to countries firmly in the US sphere of influence, usually in Latin America. Iran was decidedly not in the American orbit. President Taft conceivably saw Iran's request for American advisors as an opportunity to spread informal US influence to a new area, even as his State Department was unwilling to expand official US involvement there. Yet Schuster and his team apparently worked in the interests of Iran, not US financial and business interests, as was typically the case with dollar diplomacy. The Americans could have steered Iran toward US banks or companies if they had so desired, but in the end, the Iranian government received no American loans, although it wanted them. Also contrary to typical dollar diplomacy arrangements, Schuster and his team were not simply advisors, but rather exercised direct power as high-ranking government officials. Schuster explained that as Treasurer General, he had, quote, entire control of the financial operations and fiscal affairs of that country. The financial decisions of all government branches, including the cabinet ministries, had to go through him. Although the Schuster mission did not fit the Taft administration's typical approach to extending US informal influence abroad, it did shape how the American public saw Iran and influenced many Iranians to have a positive view of Americans. I'll return to those perceptions a little bit later in the talk, but I want to turn now to a discussion of who Schuster was and what he actually did in Iran. Morgan Schuster is an intriguing figure. Born in Washington, D.C. in 1877, he was a graduate of Columbia University and Law School, which is today George Washington University. In 1899, while still in his early 20s, Schuster went to Cuba to work in customs collection. He left Cuba in 1901 to become the U.S. customs collector in Manila, the capital of the Philippines. Starting in 1906, Schuster became the Secretary of Public Instruction and was a member of the Second Philippine Commission, which was headed by future President William Howard Taft. And that's how Taft met Schuster and later came to recommend him to Iran. Schuster resigned in early 1909 and returned home to Washington, D.C., where he practiced law until he went to Iran in 1911 at the age of 34. Thus, his early career followed the streams of empire. He was first an agent of US imperialism in Cuba and the Philippines, and later became an outspoken critic of imperialism in Iran. Now, unfortunately, the historical record on Schuster prior to 1911 is spotty, but based on the available documents related to Schuster's work in the Philippines, it appears as though Schuster embraced the American civilizing mission during that period. Schuster was also the epitome of white, middle class, Protestant, male progressivism with a capital P. He believed in honesty, expertise, fair play, and efficient management. The American progressive movement at the time was diverse, but Schuster belonged to a generation of progressives who, despite their differences, sought reform and to wield state power on behalf of the common good. Along with their quest for social justice at home, many American progressives also looked abroad. Although they disagreed sharply over US colonization of new territories like the Philippines, progressive internationalists hoped to transform the world to be more democratic, civilized, and just. Such beliefs drove Schuster's work as a tool of US empire building in Cuba and the Philippines, as well as his later efforts in Iran. As customs collector in Manila, Schuster sought to eliminate corruption and enforced the letter of the law, even when he disagreed with it. His incorruptibility often made him unpopular, but it did catch the notice of his superiors. He seems to have been just as diligent and reform-minded in his position as Secretary of Public Instruction. The Schuster who went to Iran in 1911 still embodied the progressive spirit, but he was different in one key respect. Schuster was now an anti-imperialist. He was an outspoken critic of Russian and British imperial attempts to subjugate Iran, and after his return home, he publicly denounced imperialism in general, including that practiced by the United States, and he even later called for Filipino independence. It's possible that Schuster was changed by his years in the Philippines and that his experiences in Iran merely pushed him down an anti-colonial path he had already begun to take. Schuster had resigned his position as Secretary of Public Instruction in the Philippines for reasons unknown. Now, he may simply have wanted to go home after nearly a decade away, but it's also possible that his front row view of American empire in action had planted the seeds of doubt about the so-called civilizing mission. Schuster aligned himself with the Iranian nationalists, Democrats, and constitutionalists from day one. Clearly, he was already inclined to support the constitutionalists' anti-imperial position, and this may have been the result of his prior experiences with American empire. Of course, it's also possible that Schuster's years in the Philippines did not affect his view of empire, and that would mean that it was only his time in Iran that caused his anti-colonial transformation. What is certain is that Schuster left Iran an avowed opponent of Western imperialism. Schuster and his team arrived in Tehran in May 1911, and they quickly won the nearly unqualified support of the Majlis. First, Schuster, Cairns, McCaskey, Hills, and Dickey brought their wives and children with them to Iran, in contrast to European diplomats and advisors who typically did not bring their families. The Iranians saw this choice and the Americans' devotion to their families as a positive sign. Schuster's immediate alignment with the reform-minded constitutionalists in the Majlis also earned their trust. The Majlis was Schuster's employer, after all, but he also believed in the justness of their cause. It was also clear from the get-go that Schuster and his team meant to do the job they were hired to do, and that they would work diligently and honestly on Iran's behalf. Thus, within weeks of his arrival, and lasting throughout his time in Iran, Schuster secured the Majlis's unwavering support for his proposed reforms. This included concentrating all financial authority in his hands and giving him power over other foreign advisors and the Iranian cabinet. The support of the Majlis was necessary for Schuster's success, but the situation in Iran at the time placed Schuster in the middle of a power struggle between Iran and the imperial powers. After the Schuster mission's arrival in Tehran in May, the remainder of 1911 proved to be a period of upheaval and instability. The ex-Shah, Muhammad Ali, returned to Iran that summer with the tacit support of Russia and attempted to raise an army so he could retake the throne. One of his brothers also led a revolt to try to seize power. The constitutionalist government fended off both challengers by early fall, but the royalist revolts had contributed to political instability. The government also faced tribal conflicts, and there had been frequent turnover in the Iranian cabinet. Plus, of course, Iran faced pressure from Great Britain and Russia to limit reform so the two powers could maintain their influence. I'm going to pause for a second. Bahman, you have your hand up? No? Okay. So Schuster and his team navigated the situation as best they could while instituting an ambitious and wide-ranging reform plan that they also implemented rather rapidly. They aimed to ease the burden of Iran's existing debts, make the government's financial operations more efficient, and generate revenue. Schuster's actions strengthened his support in the Majlis, but they put him on a collision course with both the Iranian cabinet and the imperial powers. Prime Minister Samsam al-Sultaneh led the cabinet at the time, and the cabinet ministers tend to hail from the old bureaucratic elite. Although they supported reform in principle, in practice, they tended to resist reform when it applied to their own work. Throughout the summer and fall of 1911, tensions grew between Schuster and the cabinet. The ministers were unhappy that they had to ask him every time their ministries required money. Schuster, for his part, did not see them as trustworthy, and the ministers resented Schuster's interference in their affairs. They became increasingly resistant to his reform attempts. Now, the cabinet ministers were the Iranian leaders who were most willing to play the British and Russian great game, and Schuster pointedly refused to play. He could not have satisfied the imperial powers while also winning the support of the Majlis. Much to the annoyance of the British and Russian diplomats stationed in Tehran, Schuster did not present himself to their legations upon his arrival. It was months before he met with the British and Russian ministers. His snub reflected his view that Russia's and Great Britain's claims on Iran were illegitimate. By November of 1911, Schuster's unwavering refusal to accommodate Britain and Russia had earned him the enmity of their governments. It's a complicated story, but the short version is that Schuster's reforms threatened Russia's interests in Iran and irritated Britain by threatening the delicate balance of power they had struck with Russia regarding Iran. Schuster persistently refused to consult either power regarding his reforms. Especially galling to Russia, Schuster appointed British citizens to several positions in the Iranian government in northern Iran, which Russia viewed as its sphere of influence. Schuster's refusal to consult Russia on these appointments, even after their strenuous objections over his attempt to appoint the British Major C.B. Stokes to a post in the north that summer, finally proved intolerable to them. Now, from Schuster's perspective, diplomatic niceties and political considerations were unwelcome distractions from reform, and he did not intend to allow foreign meddling to thwart Iran's aspirations. Frustrated by Britain's and Russia's attempts to block his reforms, Schuster finally published a scathing letter in the London Times in November 1911, criticizing British and Russian behavior. Schuster's stance pleased the Majlis. Consulting the Russians and British certainly would have weakened his reforms and lost him the support of the constitutionalists, who were fierce opponents of European imperialism. Yet Schuster's independence did threaten Russian interests. The Americans strengthened the political position of the Democrats and reformers in the Majlis at the expense of the Iranian cabinet, who had been more willing to accommodate the Europeans. Schuster's attempts to appoint British citizens to posts in Iran's north certainly made sense from Schuster's perspective. These men had the necessary expertise, experience with Iran, and probably most important, his trust. But from Russia's perspective, their presence enhanced British influence at Russia's expense, and Schuster was to blame. If Schuster succeeded in his reforms, Iran would regain much of the sovereignty it had lost to the Europeans and would chart a more independent course. Russia could not allow that to happen. So in the end, Russia issued ultimatums to the Iranian government in November, demanding that they fire Schuster. When the Majlis refused, Russian troops invaded and marched on the capital, ultimately forcing the cabinet to suspend the Majlis and fire Schuster in December 1911. Thus ended Iran's revolution. Morgan Schuster departed Tehran in early January 1912. His Iranian adventure had made him a minor celebrity back in the United States, so he used that spotlight to launch a campaign to rally American public support for Iran and condemn imperialism. While the US news media already expressed support for Iranian constitutionalists, there is evidence that Schuster's message resonated with the attentive American public, which helped cement a positive view of Iranians in the US public sphere at the time. Prior to the Constitutional Revolution, Americans appear to have had little understanding of Iran, or Persia, as they called it at the time. Aside from missionaries and a handful of diplomats, few Americans had direct experience with Iran or Iranians prior to the 20th century. For the public then, Persia was bound up in the broader American Orientalist imagination about the supposedly exotic and inferior East. This situation began to change as a result of the Constitutional Revolution. While Iran never became a major topic of public discussion at the time, American journalists reporting on the Constitutional Revolution brought Iran into sharper relief for the public. There was fairly regular US newspaper reporting on Iran throughout the period of the revolution, especially in the New York Times, a national newspaper of record, although it's unlikely that any American reporters were actually on the ground there. The most common news articles about Iran before 1911 were short, descriptive articles that relayed news of important events. But American news media also printed several pro-constitutionalist articles and editorials. These were typically longer pieces, including feature articles in the New York Times Sunday magazine. The nature of the Constitutional Revolution appealed to progressive era Americans who read papers like the New York Times. These Americans tended to believe that social problems could be solved through the application of education, expertise, and efficiency. They saw government as a positive tool for social change, and among other things, emphasized democracy, merit, and fair play. In the United States, progressives fought against political corruption and expanded democracy by introducing the ballot initiative, referendum, and recall. That large numbers of Iranians fought for and defended a democratically elected parliament and other reforms in a part of the world most Americans had been conditioned to see as inherently corrupt and despotic, captured US public attention and spoke to the progressive imagination. Iran's cause likely later appealed to Schuster for the same reasons. Taken as a whole, American reporting on the Constitutional Revolution before the Schuster mission contained pro-constitutionalist themes. There was a sense in these articles that the revolution was motivated by noble principles that Americans shared, especially the desire for representative government. These historical dynamics implicitly contradicted long-standing American stereotypes of Muslim-majority peoples as both inherently violent and passively accepting of despotic rule. Journalists' portrayals of the constitutionalists at the time as principled, honest, wise, and in control of their passions would have appealed to middle-class Americans living in the progressive era. The New York Times thus generally positioned the Iranian constitutionalists as people worthy of American sympathy and admiration. Unsurprisingly, American newspapers became more interested in Iran's affairs once Americans became directly involved in the political drama unfolding overseas. Given the unusual nature of the Schuster mission, it was a sensational topic that drew significant attention in the US public sphere at the time. While most American news reports on Iran in 1911 and early 1912 focused on Schuster, they did draw more attention to Iranians' situation. Schuster then used the intense public interest in his story to criticize Britain and Russia and campaign for greater American public support for Iran. According to the available evidence, this all translated into the attentive American public's increased sympathy for Iranian constitutionalists and a reduction in stereotypical depictions of Iranians at the time. From Schuster's appointment in late spring 1911 through the early months of his mission that summer, US newspapers typically expressed curiosity and pride that Iran chose Americans as advisors. Those same newspapers also praised Schuster and the Iranians for meeting the many challenges they faced. An April 1911 New York Times Sunday magazine article feature that is depicted here on the slide is an example of this kind of reporting. This article reported on the appointment of American advisors to Iran and included an extended celebration of Iranian progress under the constitutionalist government. With clear approval, the article noted, quote, "The desire for and determination to have a sound and effective fiscal system manifested by the Persians is only one indication of the new spirit by which they are ruled. Severe tests have shown that they are firmly set on carrying out a modern, progressive, and enlightened policy in all directions." And, quote, "In all these activities, the Persians are giving special attention to the example of the people of the United States." So the message was clear. Schuster and his men were engaged in a noble mission to assist Iran in achieving progressive goals and becoming more like the United States. Such articles quickly gave way to even more forceful pro-Schuster and pro-Constitution pieces that fall and winter due to Russia's opposition to Schuster's reform agenda. By November and December 1911, after Russia called for Schuster's dismissal, the New York Times reporting took on the tone of a melodrama. The paper cast Russia and sometimes Britain as the greedy, treacherous villains bent on, quote, swallowing Persia, while Schuster was the, quote, plucky hero who was defending Persia, the damsel in distress. A November 1911 Sunday magazine article pictured here is an example of this kind of editorializing. Its headline blazed dramatically from the page, "How Russia Came to Make War on W. Morgan Schuster." The piece's author argued that the Schuster mission would have been Iran's salvation, but for Russian and British interference. Describing how Schuster and his team, quote, "5 thoroughly American Americans approached their task like good progressives, quote, without fear or favor, without axes to grind, and with no interest on earth except that of rendering business-like service to their employers." The article argued that Russia sought Schuster's dismissal precisely because he and his team were upright men. The Americans refused to bow to foreign pressure, so the Russian bear, quote, growled. Schuster was unintimidated and, quote, "He will not back down. For all his life long, he had been accustomed to facing difficult propositions, and a czar or two was nothing to him." Schuster was clearly the main protagonist in the New York Times coverage of the unfolding crisis in Iran. Articles like this one also cast Iran as in need of American rescue. In this way, the articles echoed older stereotypes that feminized Muslim men and broader American characterizations of non-Europeans in general at the time as effeminate, weak, and in need of American tutelage. Yet American reporting was not consistently stereotypical in its depiction of the Iranians. The New York Times praised the manly bravery of the Majlis deputies who stood up to Russia and refused to submit to its demand that they fire Schuster. When the Iranian cabinet finally gave in and dismissed the Treasurer General at the end of December, the paper was quick to note that Iran had no other choice, and they blamed Russia for Schuster's ouster. What followed was the melodrama's inexorable, tragic conclusion. Forced to send Schuster away and disband the Majlis, Russia was now unprotected. The Russian villain let his troops rampage throughout the countryside to punish Persia for her defiance, and Persia's budding democracy was killed by foreign intrigue. Now, upon his return home, Morgan Schuster used this media spotlight to reinforce the narrative of tragedy and campaign for the American public's support for Iran. Henceforth, his vision of events dominated American perceptions of what had happened to Iran's revolution. Schuster's outspokenness and his sensational story kept Iran in the public eye for months after his return, well into 1912. Newspapers across the United States and abroad broadcast his account. According to Schuster, Iranian constitutionalists and nationalists were self-sacrificing, honorable men and women who loved their country and sought to reform it so that it might become a modernized, prosperous, democratic nation state, not unlike the United States. But Imperial Britain and Russia had strangled Iran's infant democracy in its cradle, as the title of Schuster's highly cited 1912 memoir, The Strangling of Persia, asserted. All liberty-loving, progressive Americans should be outraged by Britain's and Russia's, quote, selfish and, quote, bullying actions, according to Schuster. In making his case, Schuster advanced an anti-imperialist and remarkably anti-Orientalist argument to his audience. And yet, in late 1909, 2 years earlier, Schuster had publicly expressed Orientalist and Islamophobic views when describing the Muslim Moro population of the Philippines, whom he had characterized as, quote, untamed fanatics who were, quote, by nature turbulent, lawless, and bloodthirsty. At that point, he clearly had espoused the prevailing American assumptions about the Moros and all Muslims by extension at the time, as described by historian Corinne Walther in her book, Sacred Interests. Yet Schuster did not apply these same assumptions to Iranians by 1911. Now, I suspect this was due to Schuster's close contact with Iranians, whereas it's very unlikely he encountered any Moros while he was in the Philippines. So Iranians were therefore real people to him. And Schuster thus committed himself to work in the interest of his Iranian friends. Based on the way he spoke about Iran and Iranians, it appears that Schuster had not fully absorbed the prevailing racist and Orientalist notions in the United States that characterized Islam and democracy as incompatible, and that cast Muslim majority peoples as incurably backward and inferior to Americans. The difference is striking between Schuster's statements about Iranians and most other American discussions about Islam and Muslims at the time. Many scholars have demonstrated that Americans primarily understood Muslim-majority countries within the framework of religion in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. So Schuster was the outlier. He did not use religion as a lens to explain Iran to the American public. In his book, in his diary, and his interviews with journalists, Schuster rarely mentioned Iranians' religion. When he did discuss Islam and Iran, he passed no judgment on it. In fact, Schuster often seemed to rebuke other Americans' stereotypical assumptions. He made it a point several times in his book to describe how large numbers of Iran's Islamic priests, as he called them, supported the revolution, even though the clerical class, quote, stood to lose much of its traditional influence and privilege. If, as Orientalist thinking went, Islam was incompatible with democracy and modernity, why would the mullahs support constitutionalism? Schuster implied, therefore, that American assumptions had to be wrong. Schuster also refuted stereotypes of Muslim women when he praised Iranian women's participation in the revolution. Although he noted women's subordinate status in Iran, he conspicuously did not blame that on Islam, as Americans traditionally would have done. He explained, quote, without the powerful moral force of Iranian women, quote, the ill-starred and short-lived revolutionary movement, however well conducted by the Persian men, would have early paled into a mere disorganized protest. It was the women did much to keep the spirit of liberty alive. In contradiction to American stereotypes of Muslims at the time, Schuster thus did not characterize Iranian women as silent, helpless victims of Islamic despotism. When Schuster did criticize Iranians, usually the cabinet ministers, he judged them by the same criteria he applied to Americans and Europeans. Schuster was unsparing in his criticism for those he thought sought only their own gain, were corrupt, or were lackeys of Russia or Britain. But Schuster did not blame these men's greed, corruption, or lack of patriotism on their religion, as most other Americans at the time would have done. Theirs were purely personal failings, according to Schuster. In contrast, Iranians who were patriotic, honest, or had worked to build a better country earned Schuster's praise, whether Muslim or not. Schuster expressed admiration for a number of Iranians, and his praise was often effusive. Ephraim Khan, chief of police in Tehran, and an Armenian Christian with whom Schuster worked closely, drew Schuster's acclaim for his trustworthiness and courageous defense of the capital. The American declared Ephraim Khan, quote, a man of great resource, undoubted military genius, and unflinching courage. Schuster also commended Hussein Kuli Khan, the former Minister of Foreign Affairs, whom Schuster described as honest and, quote, a high-minded gentleman and a patriot of unfailing devotion to the interests of his country. Based on his assessment of the constitutionalists' characters and ability, Schuster argued forcefully that Iranians were capable of building a modern nation state and running their own affairs. Schuster was adamant that constitutionalism's failure in Iran was not the fault of the Iranians. After praising the Majlis members for their patriotism and, quote, remarkable talent, character, and courage, Schuster declared that, quote, no parliament can be rightly deemed incompetent when it has the support of an entire people, when it recognizes its own limitations, and when its members are willing to undergo great sacrifices for their nation's dignity and sovereign rights. As for the Iranian people, Schuster said, quote, they changed despotism into democracy in the face of untold obstacles. Opportunities were equalized to such a degree that any man of ability could occupy the highest official posts. As a race, they showed during the past 5 years an unparalleled eagerness for education. A remarkable free press sprang up overnight, and fearless writers came forward to denounce injustice and tyranny, whether from within their country or without. The Persians were anxious to adopt wholesale the political, ethical, and business codes of the most modern and progressive nations. Schuster's characterization of the Iranian people flew in the face of the common wisdom in the United States at the time that Muslim-majority peoples were incapable of modernizing unless they converted to Christianity or were ruled by the West. There's evidence that Schuster's arguments resonated with the American public. As journalists reported on the Russian attacks on Schuster in November and December, the New York Times alluded to public pressure on the Taft administration to intervene. Members of the House of Representatives even proposed resolutions that December calling for the US action to support Schuster and Iran, which potentially included military intervention. And while the resolutions never made it to a vote, they indicate strong public support for Schuster. Large crowds also gathered to hear Schuster speak about Iran in multiple venues after his return to the United States in early 1912. The crowd celebrated Schuster and the Iranian constitutionalists. So these crowds, the proposed congressional revolution, and the popularity of Schuster's The Strangling of Persia, which has been reprinted many times in the century since its publication, suggests that there was significant public opinion in favor of Schuster and constitutionalist Iran. While stereotypes did not disappear from American characterizations of Iranians, Schuster's anti-imperialist, anti-Orientalist, and pro-constitutionalist arguments did influence how Americans saw Iran at the time. The evidence suggests that American perceptions of Iran shifted in a positive direction as a result of the Schuster mission, and this is important. The news media's attention to Iran's revolution and the Schuster mission made Iran appear as a less distant place for Americans than before. This, in turn, helped distinguish Iran from other Muslim-majority countries and perhaps accounts for the more ambiguous, less consistently stereotypical American characterizations of Iranians in the years that followed. Newspaper articles during the revolution and Schuster's public relations campaign on Iran's behalf had made the attentive public understand that Iranians wanted representative government, true national sovereignty, and progress. They also deserved sympathy and support. The dramatic story of the Schuster mission also made a lasting impression that translated into greater American attention to Iran thereafter. Schuster cast Iranians as sympathetic, and his story instilled a sense that American know-how was welcome in Iran. Thus, despite the official policy of non-involvement at the time for the US government, American non-state actors increasingly traveled to Iran and forged ties with Iranians in the decades to come. By the 1940s, the US government followed the lead of these non-state actors and became increasingly involved in Iran's affairs. The period of the Constitutional Revolution and the Schuster mission laid the foundation for this increased American interest in and contacts with Iran and Iranians. The Schuster mission also laid the foundations for how Americans saw Iranians and vice versa. This early period is therefore important to understanding the longer history of the US-Iran relationship. So to conclude, 3 aspects of Schuster's story are especially relevant to the discussion of American-Iranian friendship, which is, of course, the mission of the Baskerville Institute. First, unlike most other Westerners, Schuster did not see Iranians as inferior. By treating Iranians as capable and as equals, Schuster was able to forge genuine friendships with many Iranians. This allowed him to avoid the stereotypical thinking about Middle Eastern peoples common among Americans, as well as European diplomats and other Westerners in Iran at the time. Schuster's honest work on Iran's behalf and his respectful treatment of his host earned him significant goodwill. Second, Schuster was not afraid to do the right thing, even when doing so was dangerous. Schuster's life was threatened in Iran, and he ultimately lost his job. Nevertheless, Schuster remained committed to the constitutionalist cause, so his reliability and integrity contributed significantly to his winning Iranians' trust. Third, Schuster was a steadfast friend. Even after his dramatic expulsion from Tehran, Schuster continued to speak out on Iran's behalf. Thus, Schuster's honesty, respectfulness, reliability, and genuine support for Iranian constitutionalism forged a lasting friendship. When Iranians once again requested American financial advisors in the 1920s, they asked for Schuster. Now, for various reasons, the State Department prevented that from happening, but Schuster, for his part, was eager to return to Iran. The recent history of US-Iran relations has been marked by hostility, but there is an older and longer history of friendship that we can learn from. After the Trump administration escalated tensions with Iran, policymakers in the Biden administration must earn Iranians' trust and prove that the United States is acting in good faith if they hope to ease tensions. Perhaps Morgan Schuster can provide a good model for Americans today to follow as they work toward better relations. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Kelly, for that excellent presentation. There was so much you packed into that presentation that is definitely worth a couple of books. So I'm going to give you a break to catch your breath. And so I will start with a couple of questions that I got, and then Matt would also summarize some of the questions. The most fascinating aspect of your presentation was the question of American Orientalism, American perception of the East and the Muslim world, and how Morgan Schuster kind of broke this perception that Muslim world is always part of that Orientalist picture. And so the question is, was that perception the result of his interactions with Iranians as distinct with other parts of the Middle East and Muslim world? Or was it really because Morgan Schuster was a bureaucrat, a professional, someone who saw everything in a very professional business-like manner?
That's a great question. I mean, so there's only so much that historians can do to actually know our historical actors. So I'm interpreting what I know of Schuster based on what he's left behind. And I think, you know, he didn't talk a lot about people in other parts of the Middle East. So I'm not entirely sure how he might have seen Arabs or Turks, for instance. I do have that one instance where he gave that speech in 1909 where he very much repeated the stereotypes of the Moros that US policymakers were advancing at the time. And those were troubling because the US used those ideas about the Moros as fanatics and uncivilized to justify genocidal violence against that population in the Philippines during the first decade of the 20th century. But with Schuster, I think part of it is that for the Iranians, as I mentioned, he got to know them. And I think it's highly unlikely he ever would have met a Moro when he was in Manila because they were in a different part of the country. But the Iranians he worked closely with, he developed friendships with, he could see that they did not fit the stereotype. But I do agree that part of it has to do with that progressive era ideology of expertise and efficiency and trying to eliminate other distractions from business, you know, so that these stereotypes and culture and even for him, diplomacy and politics really were things that he didn't want to have to deal with, and he just wanted to do his job. But based on his effusive praise for the Iranians, I think that he really did genuinely see them in a different light than he had seen other people. But how that might have impacted his views of other Middle Eastern peoples, I have no idea because I couldn't find him talking about other groups. So,
great, thank you.
Thanks.
So, Matt, would you go forward with other questions that we've received?
Yeah, we have great questions coming in, and I would just say to everyone out there to continue asking them, and we'll do our best to get everything covered. There's a lot of substance in the questions that we currently have. One question relates to kind of the larger context that informs Schuster's work. The question asks if you could talk about how the economic concessions or capitulations of this period, especially the Darcy oil concession and others like it, would have affected Schuster's work, or perhaps affected something, the view of Schuster in Iran in that particular moment?
Yeah, there's so much I left out of the story, especially what actually went on when he was in Tehran. For those of you who might not know this history, since the 19th century, the British and the Russians had gotten economic concessions out of the Iranian government. And these concessions were part of the reason the revolution happened, because the Iranian people were very unhappy that foreign powers were increasing their influence over Iran's economy and, by extension, its political affairs. Probably the most infamous is the Darcy oil concession to the United Kingdom in 1901 that gave them significant control over Iranian oil reserves. And this, I think you could draw a straight line from that to the oil crisis with Mossadegh in the early 1950s. But there were other things like a tobacco concession that had sparked protests. When Schuster came to Iran, some of these concessions were still in force and he had to work around them. So some of the issue is that the customs collections of the Iranian government, those customs revenues then had to go to pay Iran's debts, pre-existing debts to the European banks. And so Schuster was trying to navigate around this by coming up with revenue generating projects, making tax collection more efficient so that the government could actually, benefit from the tax money that it collected, and, money wouldn't get siphoned off along the way on its way to the top. He attempted to negotiate a loan with the Seligman Brothers branch in London, which was a subsidiary of, I talk with my hands too much. It was a subsidiary of an American company, but it was completely independent by that point. And the goal of the loan was to pay off some of the Iranian loans to a Russian bank so that they would have a lower interest rate on their payments, and then also use some of that Seligman loan to fund the revenue generating projects that Schuster had in mind. But his proposal, his attempt to negotiate the loan with the Seligman brothers aroused Russian outrage because it would take away some of the leverage that their loans had over Iran. And so he had to navigate a lot of these things. And in a lot of ways, it was a really nearly impossible situation. There's no way he could have pleased both the European powers and the Iranian government. And so he was trying to do his best. But I think he generally did okay. I mean, some of his reforms allowed the Iranian government to pay their troops to put down the royalist revolts that summer by Muhammad Ali Shah and his brother. So it generated some resentment within the cabinet, especially when Schuster had a very tight control over how much money he would parcel out. But he did also make it possible for the Iranian government to function during that chaotic period. But he faced a lot of challenges, and I would say the biggest ones came from some of those concessionary agreements that Iran already had with the Europeans. Long-winded answer.
It's really interesting. We have another question that deals with the position of the U.S. State Department and whether or not the State Department was pro-British and hence subject to kind of maybe not objecting to British imperial interests in the way that maybe would be possible later in time. And just to kind of piggyback onto that question, do we have any evidence to suggest that Americans were so outraged about what the British and Russians did to Iran's constitutional government that it affected kind of Washington's broader read of the international system? So in the lead up to the First World War, and we're talking about Imperial Russia and Britain, does it really put a kind of a wrinkle in kind of that relationship, or is it kind of a blip on the radar and more thought of as an Iranian drama?
Those are good questions. So I'm still working through the State Department records from this time period. From what I can tell, the American public's reaction to the Iranian Revolution and the Schuster story is different from the US government's reaction. Despite the fact that Schuster and Taft were friendly and Taft had recommended Schuster, the US historically had viewed the Eastern Hemisphere as the sphere of influence for the Europeans, leaving aside parts of Asia that the United States wanted to get involved in, like China. But the Middle East, they saw as firmly in the European zone of influence. According to the Monroe Doctrine of the 19th century, the US saw the Western Hemisphere as its zone, the Eastern Hemisphere is the European zone, and it had been long-standing US policy not to get involved in European political affairs or in the affairs of countries in Africa, the Middle East, and Asia that were under European influence. So I think from the American perspective, it was less that they were pro-British and more that they just saw Iran as outside of their area of interest. For the US government, the focus was on having a generally friendly relationship with Iran to protect American missionaries and others who were stationed there, maybe have some trade, but that was pretty much it. Getting involved more vigorously, even in terms of speaking out about what happened with Iran, I think went beyond the bounds of established policy at the time. Down the line, I think for the United States, there was growing anti-Russian feeling to some extent in the US at the turn of the 20th century and into the first decade of the 20th. Russia itself underwent its first revolution in this roughly around the same time as Iran's revolution. And then of course in 1917, you get the Bolshevik Revolution. So Americans tended to trust the Russians less, but I don't think it impacted World War I in terms of US policy. I think where we do see some impact is that Iran was neutral in World War I, but it ends up getting invaded by like just about everybody in the region during the war. And American citizens create private charities to send humanitarian relief to the Iranians during World War I. And I think that sympathy for the Iranians, you probably can trace that back to Americans starting to pay attention to Iran during the revolution and then seeing how Iran's revolution gets crushed. And then now a couple years later, it's being invaded and there's hunger and there's disease. So Americans raise money and they send help. But again, it's, the American public versus the government have very different views on the subject.
There's a question I'll note about whether or not we have any evidence or secondary literature even about how the Russian media would have been portraying Morgan Schuster. Do we know if he was an international phenomenon outside of the United States and Iran?
Yeah. So the scholars' names are escaping me at the moment, and I apologize for that. But there are books and articles written about Russia and Iran in this period, and there's actually not a lot of scholarship done on the Schuster mission itself, which is surprising. I mean, everybody refers to Schuster as if people already know the story, but aside from his own The Strangling of Persia, there's one monograph from the 70s by a historian named McDaniel that gets really into the details of this. And I understand that there are scholars today currently working on Schuster, so we might see more. But the things that I've read that talk about the Russian press, Schuster, they really do cast Schuster as, a problem. Who's this American coming in, and who does he think he is? And he's threatening Russia's interests. And so there are anti-Schuster pieces that come out in the Russian press. And of course, the British don't receive him all that kindly either. So the London Times is reporting on him before he publishes his open letter was also not complimentary. And then if you look at his personal papers at the Library of Congress, Schuster has scrapbooks where they cut out articles from newspapers from around the world about the Schuster mission and about his public relations campaign. And so there are newspapers from other countries, mostly Europe, where he has articles in that scrapbook talking about, the controversy over his dismissal. So he does become a bit more of an international phenomenon than just the US and Iran. But I don't think it lasts long.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's fascinating.
Let me ask another question, give you a break, Matt. So if you mentioned this dichotomy between American government policy toward Iran and American public's perception of Iran before their Schuster and after Schuster mission. Do you see a similar dichotomy today in terms of how the lack of contact with Iran post-revolution and how American public's perception of Iran today is also influenced by how there are less Americans traveling to Iran, there are more government propaganda, if we could put it this way, and how does this kind of dichotomy keep continuing in American-Iranian relations? You have one picture of the public's image of Iran. Iranian public image of America today is very positive. American public's image of Iran today is very negative. And so how does this fit into our perception of Morgan Schuster and how Iranians have such a positive view of him?
I think the dichotomy in the beginning, in this early period, is because very few Americans had ever had an encounter with Iran or Iranians. Today, a lot of it has to do with Americans in the public kind of latching on to that one thing that they remember about Iran, which is the revolution and the hostage crisis. So typically Americans don't have a terribly long historical memory unless a country says they don't like the US, and then Americans hold a grudge for a really long time. Cuba being the other example, right? So Americans, they still remember, they bring up the hostage crisis and people yelling death to America. And that laid the groundwork for the public for 40 years to see all Iranians as crazy religious fanatics who hate America for some reason. And of course, that's not accurate. The Iranian public is very, very different from that. And as you mentioned, Iranians today generally see Americans positively. But I think back in the early 20th century, the US government was doing nothing to shape the public opinion on Iran because it wasn't an area of deep import to the US. So that opened up space for people like Morgan Schuster, who had direct experience to go out and really make an impact on how Americans saw Iran and Iranians. I think today the US government does shape that conversation, but the problem is that different administrations have a different narrative about Iran. And so, we just came out of 4 years of the government pushing the narrative that Iran is the biggest threat to the US and escalating tensions. So it's I think more difficult for an administration like Obama's before or Biden's now to try to shape a more positive view of Iranians in the US because of that history of the revolution and hostage crisis, and because I think that negative narrative that the Trump administration pushed fits with these stereotypes that Americans have about crazy Muslim fanatics. So I think it's going to take a lot of public diplomacy at home and very deliberate public diplomacy by the US government and scholars to change the way the American public see Iran at this point. The Iranian people, I think part of the reason why they have such a positive view of the US is because most of them are under the age of 40. They've been born since the revolution. They've grown up under a repressive regime, and a lot of them oppose their own government. So in some way, seeing the US positively becomes an act of resistance, but they also don't have direct experience of the US. So I think that American anti-Iranian sentiment that you really feel here in the US, they don't really see it in Iran, which I think is a good thing because we don't want to lose that positive view on that side. But the question is, how do you promote a positive view in the US, given the history and given that Americans generally aren't all that reflective about learning about other countries once they have a narrative in their head.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Thank you. Go ahead, Matt.
It's interesting to hear you talk about different moments when in Iran, seeing the United States favorably becomes an act of resistance.
Yes.
We could probably only identify a few of those pockets in history. Very interesting. Well, there are more great questions. One is related to Schuster's religious views. So was Schuster a Protestant progressive that would have believed in a Christian mission to save the world, or was he relatively aloof from kind of religious particularism, or perhaps didn't identify as in a religious way?
Yeah, I mean, so he's a Protestant, like the majority of white Americans were Protestant at the time, but I don't get the sense from his writings or any of the other interviews with him that I've been able to come across where religion plays a particularly large role in his worldview. So I think he's more of that kind of scientific management expertise, so again, religion just doesn't seem applicable to what he's doing, but that doesn't mean that sort of he didn't generally see Christianity in a positive way. And when in the same speech where he repeated stereotypes about the Muslim Moros in the Philippines, he spent a significant amount of time actually defending the Catholic population of the Philippines from American stereotypes of them. And I think that it's less to do with the religion and more to do with the fact that he had contact with Filipino Catholics and not with the Moros. But it's interesting that he does kind of make this distinction in that 1909 speech between Muslims and Christians, where he elevates one above the other. So, I mean, I don't think he was necessarily immune to seeing Christianity as something that was a wonderful thing to spread, but it didn't seem to be a particular focus of his.
So it sounds like Protestantism was in the mix, but it's a more of a technocratic internationalism for Schuster in a way.
Yeah, I mean, he's definitely from a different mindset than like the missionaries who had gone to Iran in the same period. He's not trying to Christianize the world. He doesn't seem to care much about the Great Commission. It's just, he's Christian just like everybody else. It's just a part of his identity, but I don't think that it was a dominant one.
That's I'm glad you referenced that, because there were some questions just about Schuster and the missionaries and what that dynamic would have been like. I don't know if you want to speak any more to that, or if we could move on to some other questions.
I don't recall coming across any sources where Schuster really had much direct interaction with the missionaries. He was mostly interacting with his Iranian hosts, and then the American minister to Tehran, Charles Russell. And then later in the fall, he does start to meet with the British and Russian ministers as well. And they become pretty friendly. The Get Rid of Schuster contingent actually come out of Moscow and London. They're not actually, the ministers on the ground actually like him quite a bit. But yeah, the missionaries, I don't really see them, at least I don't see any evidence of them playing much of a role in the Schuster mission.
There's a question that kind of pivots us away from kind of ideology and maybe the intent of individual actors to kind of the material circumstances. And the question is actually very brief and succinct. Did Schuster support American financial interests? And I would kind of interpret that to mean, do we need to think about Schuster in the context of American economic expansion, the so-called open door? Do we need to think about that with Schuster, or do you see kind of these kind of ideological elements as being more significant? So how do we think of him in kind of this global American capitalism context?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think that, and I alluded to this with the dollar diplomacy discussion in the talk, I think that from the US government's perspective, sending Schuster and his team to Tehran was a good move for expanding informal American influence. And maybe it might lead to further economic ties between the two countries down the line. If that happened, I think the Taft administration would have looked very favorably on that. From Schuster's perspective, I actually don't think that he saw himself as acting in the United States' interest at all once he was in Tehran. He told anybody who would listen that, the Majlis were his employers, he was working for them. The Iranians even asked him to have closer ties with the US if he could make that happen. They wanted American loans. And he demurred, he pushed them in a different direction. So I think he certainly had the power to, maybe nudge Iran more into the American economic orbit, but he chose not to. The problem is that he wasn't a particularly introspective person, at least in terms of the writing that he left behind. So he didn't tend to talk about what he was thinking when he did things. He's very matter of fact. I went here, I did this. He does express his opinion about certain individuals, but he doesn't often talk about his own thought processes, even in his private diary. His diary from Iran is just, it's basically a chronicle, where he went, who he met with, what he did, how much money he spent on things. But it's not a journal in a sense where he talks about his thoughts. But based on the available evidence, I really don't think that he was thinking about American expansion or interests at all when he was there. Later, when the second American financial mission goes in the 1920s under Arthur Chester Millspaugh, I think there is more of a sense of trying to extend informal American economic influence with that mission. But with Schuster, I really think his primary goal was trying to get Iran out of its predicament. It's an interesting guy.
It's very interesting. I think that leads us to another question about Millspaugh. So one person is asking, why did Millspaugh's mission last so much longer in Iran in contrast to Schuster's mission? I think Millspaugh was in Iran for 4 or 5 years, right?
Yeah.
So what are your observations on Millspaugh's mission as contrast to Schuster's mission?
Yeah, so I'm still working on the research for the 20s. I haven't gone through all the Millspaugh stuff yet, but from what I have read, first I'll say Millspaugh was no Schuster. He was not nearly as friendly with his Iranian hosts as Schuster was. And he was certainly much more of the mindset that Americans were superior. And he went in more combative than Schuster did. But I think that he lasted longer because Iran was in a different situation in the 1920s. Reza Shah had was in the process of coming to power when the Millspaugh mission went there. So Russia was no longer really in the picture very much because it had had its own revolution in 1917, kind of withdrew from Middle Eastern affairs for a little while. The Anglo-British agreement of 1919 had gotten shot down, and so Britain kind of pulled back a little bit. And then Reza Shah tried to push the country in a more independent direction. So Millspaugh didn't have to deal with the Russians and the British the way the Schuster did. Iran was more able to chart its own course in the 20s. But a lot of scholars who've looked at Millspaugh argue that he lasted as long as he did because in the beginning, what he was doing was in Reza Shah's interests. And then towards the end, he started to conflict with what Reza Shah wanted. And so he had to go. But I think, if Schuster had gone back in the 20s, he would have faced a much more open situation, and his job would have been a bit easier than it had been in 1911. So I have no doubt that a Schuster mission would have lasted quite a while in the 20s if he'd been allowed to return. But I think he was too independent. The State Department didn't want another international incident or something.
That's right.
Yeah.
Good.
I'm curious, and this relates to another question we have, because even Peace Corps volunteers would have been in Iran for 2 years, and of course many stayed on much longer. So we have a history of Americans spending years, and in some cases decades in the missionaries' cases in Iran. Schuster was there for a very short period, like less than a year or right around a year.
It was like 7 months.
Did he? So a really short time. Did he do like homework to get ready for the trip? Was he in his correspondences? Was he talking to people of kind of experts in the field, maybe E.G. Brown or people who would have been kind of known to be kind of authorities in Iran in the West? What are who's he talking to about Iran, and what are they talking about?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I don't get the sense that he gave Iran much thought before he got their job offer. But once he did, being Schuster and believing in expertise, he did do his homework before he went. But there's not a whole lot of documentation of the specifics of that. So I do think he read E.G. Brown's book, which would have just come out a couple years earlier. I think it was 1906 or 1908 it came out. And then on his way, so it took a very long time to get from Washington, D.C. to Tehran. On his way to Iran, they went to Istanbul, and he met with Iranian exiles while he was there, and he gauged their take on the constitutional revolution, and he gauged their take on the European imperialists, and they steered him towards the constitutionalists and the democratic factions in the Majlis. So I think he had for somebody who didn't speak the language or really know much about Iran before getting a job offer there, I think he had a pretty good intuitive sense of what the political situation looked like, in part because he did speak to these Iranian exiles. So he was able to hit the ground running when he showed up in May. But yeah, it was only, I mean, from May to December, that's 7 months. That's not very long at all.
All right. Well, again, so many great questions. I'm doing our best to get to all of them in some way, shape, or form. One question reads like this, and it relates to kind of your discussion of progressive internationalism. How much of Schuster's reforms were driven by American progressivism, and how much did he actually engage with Iranians and what they wanted? So I guess the question is, was Schuster kind of projecting his own American progressive values into Iran, or was he really engaging with his Iranian hosts and finding kind of points of commonality between the two different visions, or how do we assess that balance?
I think it was both. He certainly brought his American progressive vision with him, and he had a certain way of doing things that he'd learned coming up through the ranks through Cuba and the Philippines when he worked for the US. I think he had a certain way of thinking that a government is a government, finances are finances. And so I think he recognized that some of those practices were not in line with the tradition of the Iranian government, but from his perspective, well, that was part of the problem. So, for instance, when he tried to institute budgets for the cabinet ministries, he requested from the ministers an estimation of their financial needs for the year, because they hadn't had a set budget before. And this is one of the things he ran up against some resistance, where the cabinet ministers just refused to give him an estimate of what they needed, because why should they have a budget? They don't know what they're going to need down the line. But from his perspective, they're always asking for all this money. So if he gives them a set budget, then they can plan instead of constantly coming up with new requests. So I think when it comes to the Iranians, he listened to what Iranians wanted if they were the like-minded factions. So, the Democrats, the nationalists are telling him, we need to get out from under the thumb of these expensive loans to the Russians and the British. Okay, so he goes off and does that. We need to have revenue so that we can pay for things. So he'll do that. But I think the specifics of what he did tended to just come from his American progressive, like, this is how you run a financial organization, and it doesn't matter what country it is, they should all be the same, because it's about expertise, it's not about culture, and it's not about anything else. So, yeah. But, the Iranians who disagreed with him, especially in the cabinet, certainly did not appreciate everything he was trying to do.
So have you had a chance to, when Schuster lived until his 80s, right? He died?
Yeah, he died in 1960.
1960. So New York Times published an obituary of him. Have you had a chance to look at the New York Times obituary of Schuster in 1960s in contrast to American media perception of him in 1912, 13, and see whether that obituary that New York Times wrote about him was kind of again, transformed by American policy, particularly after Mossadegh and all that, and so forth. So how would you compare American media coverage of Schuster in 1960 when he died to the coverage that he got in 1912, 13 in Iran?
You know, that's a great question. And I have read the obituary, but I haven't read it in a couple months. So I honestly don't remember the details of it. I'm sorry. But that is a good question. I think I should go back and revisit how they're portraying him. I don't think anything particularly stood out to me from the obituary about the way he's framed, but I'll certainly go back and look again. So thank you.
So
just to build on that question, he lived so long, relatively speaking, a good, healthy life. Why don't we have more literature on him? I mean, why is it that just in the last couple of years, people are beginning to turn to figures like Schuster? What can we make of that? And just related to that question, because it's in the same question here in the chat, given that he lived so long, did he take positions on perhaps the occupation of Iran during the Second World War or the 1953 coup or any of the other events that happened in U.S.-Iran relations toward the end of his life? So just how was he reading Iran late in life, and what in the world is up with the lack of scholarship on Schuster?
Yeah, so I think part of it has to do with his personal papers. They primarily focus on his 7 months in Iran and the period right after he came home as he was launching his public relations campaign on Iran's behalf. And there's very little on his time in the Philippines and Cuba, and there's very little on his time after that. I mean, there's some stuff about his daughter eloping with somebody, but for somebody who lived as long as he did and who did as much important work as he did, there's just not a lot of stuff in his personal papers. So I kind of want to go back and like, whoever put those together, like there's so much more stuff I know he had to have had that just didn't make it into the collection that's in the Library of Congress. And, quite frankly, I really wish that his wife would have an account of her time there with him too, but I haven't found it. So with that, and so I think, I would imagine that he had strong feelings about World War II and Iran and about 53, certainly, but I haven't been able to find him making any public statements about it. From my research, I haven't found him talking about international affairs in a public forum after about the 1920s. He went into publishing. He worked for Century Publishing for pretty much the rest of his career, although its name changed over the decades. And he kind of withdrew into private life. So I really wish that he'd left something talking about these. In terms of the lack of scholarship on him, I think in part it's because of the way U.S. foreign relations historians defined our field for a long time. If it's just about state-to-state diplomatic relations, then the U.S. doesn't really get all that involved in Iran before World War II. And so that earlier period just was neglected by foreign relations historians for a long time. Now we look at culture and non-state actors, and we're reevaluating what foreign relations looks like. It doesn't just have to be governments. And so there's an opportunity to go back and look at some of these earlier figures and evaluate them in a new light. For the Iranian side of things, I think there's been so much scholarship on the constitutional revolution as an Iranian story, there's fantastic scholarship looking at the role played by people from the Caucasus and kind of moving back and forth across borders during this period, and the Armenians and the Russians and the Americans, aside from Schuster, don't play a huge role in the revolution. And a lot of the scholarship that I've come across on the constitutional revolution itself kind of mentions Schuster in passing as if everybody knows who he was, but they don't delve into it because that's not the focus of the study, which is on the revolution as a whole. But I think we're in a moment where the field of history is changing enough where we're able to go back and ask these new questions. And I also think that that period from 53 forward is sort of, it's been done a lot, and people are realizing that we don't have as much scholarship on that earlier period, which I know, Matt, you and I have talked about a lot, which is why both of us are looking pre-53. Yeah. Or in Matt's case, also looking at non-state actors like students and missionaries.
So maybe one more question, Matt, and then we give Kelly a break, because I think we kind of spent more time on Schuster with her than any subject we had. We really appreciate her thorough presentation for us. So let's go with one more question for her.
All right. The issue of studying the biographies of Americans who have been active in Iran over the last century or so is kind of really at the heart of this question. And I guess what I'm wondering is, we have this kind of narrative of tragic relationship, and you use the word that Schuster used to describe the situation. And of course, we have James Bill's book, The Tragedy of American-Iranian Relations. And when we're thinking about the individuals who are wrapped up in this tragedy, or at least the history of it, if not something more dramatic, how do we kind of decipher between the men and the women on the one hand and the myths on the other, right? There's a lot of sensationalism. There's a kind of a performative element to a lot of these kind of dramatic episodes in U.S.-Iran relations. And you've spent so much time thinking about an individual like Schuster, a biography within a much larger context. And how can we kind of make sense of the humans versus the myths and the kind of talking points that have kind of been passed down to us over so many decades? Do you have any thoughts on that?
So an easy question is the end, right?
Of course.
It's certainly a challenge, especially when there's been 100+ years for some of these myths to build up. And I think the answer is to go back and contextualize the historical actors who we're looking at, put them back in their historical moments, put them back in conversation with the cultures that produced them, look at the primary sources as much as we can to see, what did they actually say? What did they actually do? What actually happened? And try not to let those myths really drive the way we're reading the evidence. I think it's a challenge for every generation of historians to not let the previous scholarship color how we're looking at our sources. But I think especially when you do get these big, dramatic, mythical figures, that we try to put that aside and look at the evidence on its own terms, and try to study these people on their own terms, and then come up with conclusions about them. So I mean, but in some cases, the myths also contain a kernel of reality, so we could certainly work them in when they're useful. I don't know if that's helpful or not.
It's very helpful, and really, I think your presentation coming on Matt's presentation earlier in January in American Connections with a role of students now. Morgan Schuster also is that important historical figure that you so much talked about, that it needs to be developed, it needs to be evolved in the bigger context. And I want to remind our viewers that next lecture will be by Professor Michael Zurinsky, and he will exactly talk about those relationship of how American missionaries in Iran during this period also interacted with Iranian culture, Iranian people. So it's part of the bigger contextualization that you so nicely put it. That's what really we need to do for American Iranian history, to kind of stay away from myth and contextualize it better. And so on behalf of the Institute, Kelly, I really want to thank you for preparing this presentation. I know it takes a lot of time to get ready for it, and looking forward to read your book chapter on Morgan Schuster when it comes out later. And we will definitely have you again. I'm sure we will bring you back again, and we can talk about different aspects of how Morgan Schuster's presence in Iran and US can motivate public diplomacy and better understanding of U.S.-Iran relations. So Matt, you want to have any other final observations on?
I have no other observations. I would just thank Dr. Shannon. I thank the audience and all the great questions that we got, and it was a really nice collaborative discussion, and I just look forward to having future discussions. Thank you.
Yes. We will have the recording of your talk ready to end. It will be available on our website for those of you who want to go back and view it more in detail. And Professor Shannon's also, her bio is available. And if you need to talk to her more or engage with her on other questions, please welcome to kind of go to that bio and that address that we have. So for our next lecture is on March 22nd with Professor Michael Zurinsky, and we will be sending you notices on that. Thank you again for joining us today, and thank you again, Kelly, for joining us from Florida, and Matt from Virginia. So we look forward to seeing you again. Thank you.
Bye. Thanks so much.